In an unusual move, the Trump administration is recalling the ambassadors from nearly 30 countries around the world.
More than 100 United States embassies suddenly left without confirmed leadership. Nearly 30 career ambassadors ordered home within a single week in late December 2025, triggering the most severe diplomatic vacuum in modern American history and quietly handing strategic ground to Canada and other middle powers. This is not a routine transition. It is not a bureaucratic reshuffle. What unfolded inside Washington just days before the new year represents a structural rupture in how the United States projects power, credibility, and economic influence during an already intensifying trade war defined by tariffs, retaliations, and global supply chain stress. Today, Analysis examines how this unprecedented decision weakened the United States at the institutional level, why the damage extends far beyond diplomacy into trade and economic security, and how Canada, often overlooked, is emerging as a stabilizing force precisely because it did not flinch. Listen carefully to the end, because the final consequence of this decision is not what most Americans have been told, and the most unsettling part has not yet surfaced. As of the final week of December 2025, 103 United States ambassadorial posts were without a Senate-confirmed ambassador, according to congressional briefings and internal State Department tallies. That figure represents more than half of the total American diplomatic missions worldwide. Of those vacancies, nearly 30 were created almost overnight by the sudden recall of career ambassadors who were still mid-term, a move without precedent since the modern Foreign Service was established more than 100 years ago. This matters because ambassadors are not ceremonial figures. They are the final authority on trade negotiations, sanctions enforcement, security coordination, and crisis response. When an embassy operates without confirmed leadership, it loses the ability to negotiate binding trade arrangements, escalate disputes, or reassure markets during instability. In practical terms, this means stalled export approvals, delayed tariff exemptions, and frozen bilateral economic initiatives. At the same moment these embassies went dark, the global trade war entered a sharper phase. Tariffs imposed by the United States over the past several years already cover trillions of dollars in global trade flows. Retaliatory tariffs from partners have raised costs for American manufacturers, farmers, and consumers alike.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout.
In this environment, diplomatic presence is not symbolic. It is the infrastructure that prevents economic shock from turning into systemic damage. Yet in Africa alone, ambassadors were recalled from 13 countries, including Nigeria, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Kenya, and Uganda. These are not marginal postings. Collectively, these economies represent hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade, critical mineral supply chains, and growing consumer markets. In Asia, key posts remain vacant in regions central to shipping lanes, technology manufacturing, and energy transit. In Europe, diplomatic gaps appeared along the eastern flank, where trade, security, and tariffs intersect daily. Markets notice absence faster than speeches. When American embassies lack leadership, counterpart governments delay cooperation, corporations hedge away from United States partnerships, and trade negotiations quietly proceed without Washington in the room. This is how influence erodes without a single vote being cast or treaty being broken. The deeper danger is not the vacancies themselves, but the signal they send. That continuity inside the United States government is now conditional, reversible, and politically fragile. Once that perception sets in, trust does not simply pause. It migrates. And here is where the story turns sharply, because while the United States was creating uncertainty, another country was doing the opposite. Stay with this analysis to the end, because the next section reveals how Canada leveraged this moment to gain economic and diplomatic ground in ways most Americans have not yet realized. The most dangerous misconception surrounding this diplomatic collapse is the belief that it remains confined to embassies, cables, and conference rooms. It does not. The consequences flow directly into the daily economic lives of American households, particularly during an intensifying trade war shaped by tariffs and retaliatory measures. When more than 100 United States embassies operate without confirmed leadership, the immediate casualty is trade coordination, tariff exemptions stall, dispute resolution slows, export approvals are delayed. These are not abstract processes. They determine how much American consumers pay for food, fuel, electronics, and manufactured goods. Since the most recent wave of tariffs expanded across metals, industrial inputs, and consumer components, import costs have risen steadily. Without senior diplomats advocating for exemptions or negotiating temporary relief, companies absorb higher costs or pass them downstream. The result is persistent upward pressure on prices at grocery stores, auto dealerships, and hardware retailers. For households already strained by inflation, this compounds economic anxiety. Farmers feel the impact even faster. Retaliatory tariffs imposed in response to United States trade actions have targeted agricultural exports repeatedly. Normally, ambassadors intervene to stabilize market access, reopen stalled channels, or prevent escalation. With embassies leaderless, American agricultural producers face longer disruptions and fewer diplomatic lifelines. Export volumes fall. Storage costs rise. Federal assistance fills some gaps, but it does not restore lost markets. Employment follows the same pattern. Manufacturing sectors dependent on imported components face cost volatility. Logistics companies experience uncertainty in shipping lanes and customs coordination. When trade relationships become unpredictable, hiring slows first, layoffs follow later. The absence of diplomatic continuity quietly magnifies these risks. What makes this moment especially severe is timing. The trade war has already weakened consumer confidence. Tariffs already distort prices. Removing diplomatic infrastructure during this phase increases the likelihood that temporary shocks become structural problems. Once supply chains reroute away from the United States, they rarely return quickly. For American households, the issue is not foreign policy theory. It is whether wages keep pace with rising costs, whether jobs remain stable, and whether economic security feels predictable. On all three fronts, diplomatic withdrawal has made conditions worse. For American corporations, the diplomatic vacuum represents a direct operational risk with measurable financial consequences. Multinational firms rely on embassies to navigate tariffs, regulatory disputes, licensing delays, and cross-border compliance. When leadership disappears, uncertainty fills the gap. Large manufacturers report slower approvals for cross-border investments. Technology firms face delays in data governance negotiations. Energy companies struggle with permitting frameworks that normally require sustained diplomatic engagement. Each delay increases costs and reduces competitiveness against foreign rivals whose governments remain fully engaged. In a trade war environment, presence matters more than leverage. Tariffs can be imposed unilaterally, but trade stability cannot be enforced without diplomats on the ground. When American embassies lack authority, foreign governments do not wait. They negotiate with whoever is available. Increasingly, that is not the United States. This is where the competitive disadvantage becomes structural. Chinese and European firms encounter fewer obstacles because their governments maintain continuous diplomatic representation. Canadian companies benefit from a reputation for reliability and continuity. Over time, contracts shift. Supply agreements are rewritten. Market share migrates quietly. Capital markets also respond. Investors price in political and diplomatic risk. When the United States appears institutionally unstable, long-term investment decisions adjust accordingly. Projects that might have been anchored in American trade frameworks move elsewhere. This does not produce an immediate crash. It produces a slow erosion. Even defense and security-related industries are affected. Trade restrictions tied to national security require constant diplomatic maintenance. Without it, allies hesitate, approvals slow, and cooperation weakens. The irony is striking. Policies intended to project strength end up undermining the very systems that sustain it. Meanwhile, Canadian firms operate in the opposite direction. With embassies staffed, trade officers active, and diplomats empowered, Canada presents itself as a safe, predictable partner amid global volatility. It does not need to win confrontations. It simply needs to remain available. This asymmetry is reshaping commercial behavior in real time. But the most unsettling consequence has not yet reached public debate. Because when corporations adapt and households adjust, the long-term damage becomes harder to reverse. Trust, once redirected, does not return easily. Stay with this analysis, because the next section reveals how this shift is altering global alliances and why Canada's rising influence is becoming impossible for the United States to ignore. In global trade and diplomacy, hesitation carries a cost. And during a prolonged trade war, that cost compounds quickly. As embassies across key regions remain leaderless, allies of the United States have begun making a calculation that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. They can no longer afford to wait for Washington. In Asia, governments managing shipping lanes, semiconductor supply chains, and energy transit require daily diplomatic coordination. Without confirmed American ambassadors, negotiations over tariffs, customs harmonization, and technology standards slow or stall entirely. In Europe, where trade policy intersects with security commitments, the absence of consistent United States leadership has introduced friction into long-standing economic frameworks. In Africa and Latin America, countries facing infrastructure, resource extraction, and market access decisions are choosing partners who are present, predictable, and authorized to act. This is not a rejection of the United States. It is a risk management decision. When trade war pressures intensify and tariffs reshape cost structures, governments gravitate towards stability. Availability becomes influence. Middle power coalitions are filling the gap. Regional trade groupings proceed without American input. Multilateral discussions, once anchored by Washington, now advance through consensus among smaller but reliable participants. Over time, this shifts agenda-setting power away from the United States, not through hostility, but through absence. For American policymakers, the danger lies in misreading this moment. Power is not being seized through confrontation. It is being redistributed through routine decisions made by officials who need answers today, not assurances tomorrow. Once new trade norms, tariff structures, and regulatory alignments take hold, reversing them becomes costly and politically difficult. The trade war accelerates this process. Tariffs amplify uncertainty. Diplomatic gaps magnify it. Together, they create incentives for partners to diversify away from reliance on the United States, even when no ideological disagreement exists. This is how leadership erodes quietly. No treaties are torn up. No alliances are formally broken. Instead, influence drains away through hundreds of small decisions made in conference rooms where American voices are no longer present. Canada has not challenged the United States. It has not exploited weakness publicly. It has done something far more effective. It has remained stable. In a global environment shaped by trade war, volatility, and expanding tariffs, Canada offers what many partners now value more than scale: continuity. Canadian ambassadors are appointed for expertise rather than political loyalty. Their mandates extend across administrations. Their authority is predictable. Their presence is uninterrupted. As American embassies fall silent, Canadian diplomats remain at their desks. Trade officers continue negotiations. Crisis coordination continues without disruption. Over time, this reliability translates into influence that does not require confrontation or spectacle. Foreign governments notice patterns. When an American counterpart changes abruptly or disappears entirely, relationships reset. When Canadian representatives remain consistent, trust accumulates. This is how Canada gains invitations to working groups, chairs, technical committees, and participates in negotiations once dominated by the United States. The trade war intensifies this advantage. As tariffs distort traditional trade routes, partners seek alternatives that reduce exposure to sudden policy shifts. Canada benefits not because it imposes fewer tariffs, but because it enforces them predictably and negotiates adjustments transparently. There is also a human dimension. Experienced American diplomats displaced by sudden recalls do not exit the global system. Many redirect their expertise toward think tanks, multilateral institutions, or foreign policy ecosystems where continuity still exists. Canada's diplomatic and policy hubs increasingly attract this talent, strengthening institutional capacity without formal recruitment. The result is subtle but powerful. Canada does not replace the United States. It reshapes expectations. It becomes the partner that answers emails, attends meetings, and follows through. In a trade war environment, those traits matter more than rhetoric. This is not a temporary advantage. Influence built on trust compounds. And once partners recalibrate toward reliability, returning to old dependencies becomes harder. What makes this moment historically dangerous for the United States is not the immediate disruption, but the trajectory it sets in motion. Diplomatic institutions, once weakened, do not recover on political timelines. They recover on generational ones. Over the next 10 years, the absence of consistent diplomatic leadership will compound three structural problems already visible in the trade war era. First is loss of agenda control. Trade frameworks, tariff coordination mechanisms, and regulatory standards are increasingly written without Washington in the room. Once adopted, these rules shape markets for decades. The United States may later re-enter discussions, but it will do so as a rule taker rather than a rule maker. Second is erosion of economic leverage. Tariffs are powerful tools only when paired with diplomacy capable of managing second-order effects. Without ambassadors empowered to negotiate exemptions, manage retaliation, and stabilize alliances, tariffs lose precision. They become blunt instruments that raise prices domestically while accelerating supply chain diversification away from American firms. Third is institutional hollowing. When career expertise is treated as disposable, recruitment suffers, retention declines. Future diplomats self-select out of service. This is not hypothetical. The Foreign Service already reports declining morale and application rates following the recalls. Over time, this degrades the very machinery that allows the United States to compete in trade, technology, and resource diplomacy. The trade war magnifies each weakness. As tariffs proliferate, the need for institutional competence rises. Instead, capacity has been reduced. This inversion, more confrontation, less coordination, is strategically unsustainable. Meanwhile, competitors and partners adapt. Markets recalibrate. Investment flows redirect. Trade relationships harden elsewhere. The cost to reverse these shifts later will be far higher than the cost of preventing them now. The most sobering reality is this. Even a future administration committed to rebuilding may find that the world has already moved on. Power does not disappear when the United States steps back. It redistributes. And in the current trade war environment, that redistribution favors countries that offer predictability over dominance. Canada embodies this shift. It does not seek to replace the United States as a superpower. Instead, it positions itself as an anchor of continuity within a fragmented system. Its diplomats remain in place. Its trade commitments remain stable. Its enforcement of tariffs is transparent and rule-based. Over time, this consistency attracts trust, investment, and influence. What makes this particularly consequential is accumulation. Each working group chaired. Each crisis consultation attended. Each trade adjustment negotiated quietly builds institutional gravity. None of it makes headlines. All of it reshapes the system. For the United States, this creates a paradox. Reasserting influence through tariffs alone accelerates the very diversification it seeks to prevent. Attempting to reclaim leadership without restoring institutional credibility risks further erosion. Even allies begin hedging, not out of hostility, but necessity. And here is the most unsettling possibility. The diplomatic vacuum did not simply weaken American influence. It taught the world how to function without it. Once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned easily. across more than 100 United States embassies will not be remembered as an isolated personnel decision. They will be remembered as a moment when institutional strength was tested under pressure and failed. In an era already defined by a prolonged trade war, expanding tariffs, and fragile global supply chains, the United States chose disruption over continuity. The cost of that choice is not theoretical. It is measured in delayed trade agreements, higher consumer prices, weakened export access, and diminished trust among allies who now quietly plan around American unpredictability. Canada, by contrast, did not announce a grand strategy. It did not challenge Washington directly. It simply remained present. In a world increasingly shaped by volatility, that alone became a source of power. By maintaining professional diplomacy, stable trade engagement, and institutional memory, Canada positioned itself as a reliable partner at the precise moment reliability became scarce. The uncomfortable truth is this: influence does not vanish overnight. It drains away gradually, replaced by those willing to shoulder responsibility when others retreat. Once partners learn they can function without United States leadership, restoring old dynamics becomes far more difficult. So the question now facing policymakers is not whether this moment mattered. It is whether the United States is prepared to rebuild trust faster than the world adapts without it. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake the United States will spend years trying to undo?